Good afternoon, everybody. I'm your host, Paul Hendricks. Good to see all of you again. I'm a past president of the South African Road Federation, and I'm currently the non-executive director on the board of Zatari, and I'll be playing the role of moderator in this webinar today. My great pleasure to welcome you to the second of the three webinars which form part of the South African National Road Agency's Road Transport Foresight study, where we will be hearing eminent thinkers' views on the future of South Africa and the road transport sector. I'm sure that a number of you attended the first webinar that was held on Friday, the 5th of May, where our two eminent thinkers, Dr. Adrian Seville and Dr. Andre Roux, presented their views on the strategic mega drivers and trends for the future of South Africa. Allow me to recap, where appropriate, some of the salient remarks I made at the first webinar for the benefit of those who were unable to attend. These three webinars comprise pre-recorded interviews with eminent thinkers selected and approved by SANRAL to consult on possible international, socio-economical and political futures for South Africa, the region and the international transport sector. The pre-recorded interviews were conducted from December 2021 to February 2022. So please note that things that influence the drivers of change, they do change constantly, and these were the opinions of the presenters at the time of interview. The current war between Russia and Ukraine had not started at time of interview, and so the impact of that global event has not been accounted for. The inputs from the interviews and webinars will form a vital part of a proposed stakeholder workshop, where further inputs will be sought, identifying the key solutions and technologies that will take SANRAL and the South African transport sector into the future. So the intent of the three webinars is firstly to give you a background to SANRAL's research and development program and its associated Foresight study project. The aim of the project will be to analyze the current state of the sector, to develop potential future scenarios, to look at a desired future for the sector and the required key solutions to take the industry to that desired future. The desktop study has been completed as part of the project, and it's identified an initial set of drivers and technologies that will impact the future of road transport. This has now been augmented with this series of eminent thinker webinars that will provide inputs into the socio-economic, political, environmental and technological future of South Africa, the South African region and internationally. So secondly, the project team has invited you to the webinars to listen to the eminent presentations, to share your expert views, either through points of clarity, critical questioning or further expert input. Today's webinar will focus on the future scenarios for South Africa and include local transport aspects. We look at the agenda. The webinar will start with some background remarks and information on SANRAL and Horizon 2030, look at its current strategy and include the research and development program to be presented by Priya Pillay from SANRAL's Communications Department. Further information on the actual Foresight project will be presented by the project manager, Dr. Rust. Once again, apologies for those that attended on Friday and who have seen these introductory presentations, but it is important that we're all aware of the context of the webinars. Like the first webinar, after the two introductory presentations, there'll be two presentations from eminent speakers, and today they will focus on the future scenarios for South Africa and the local transport aspects thereof. I will then wrap up and highlight some aspects to the way ahead. Also, in a large open forum of this nature and considering the time constraints, it won't again be possible to have any live discussions. But what we're asking you to do is to post comments and questions on the chat box. Your comments and questions can also be forwarded to chris@perc.co.za. That's chris@perc.co.za. So while the questions or comments won't be answered at this session, they will be reviewed and included in the blog where this recorded webinar will be available after the session. Let's now move on to the first introductory presentation by Priya Pillai.
Welcome to all participants in the SANRAL Eminent Thinker webinar. I am Priya Pillai from SANRAL's Communication Department. Firstly, let me provide some background to the webinar. In accordance with the SANRAL strategy, Horizon 2030, we have initiated a research and development program to position the roads industry for the future. This R&D program aims to develop key solutions and technologies across a number of focus areas, namely future transportation and technical innovation, transportation planning, public administration management and economics, pavements, asset management, traffic, road safety, geotechnical structures, drainage and hydraulics, and the environment. To this end, SANRAL has, through a formal procurement process, structured 7 research panels with more than 120 researchers participating. To position the R&D program to develop solutions for the future, we have embarked on a Foresight study. This study aims to determine the drivers of change and the trends 10 to 15 years from now that will influence the transport sector. This will be used to develop future scenarios for the transport sector, as well as a desired future that we can strive for. A second step will then be to determine the required new technologies and knowledge that will position the transport sector for the future. This webinar aims to obtain inputs and views from eminent thinkers locally and internationally about the future of South Africa and transport particularly. This input, combined with desktop research, stakeholder workshops, and futures data analysis, will be used to inform the future direction of the SANRAL R&D program. I am sure you are all, with me, looking forward to views of our eminent thinkers on the future. Enjoy the webinar.
So thank you to Priya for giving us that introduction to SANRAL's Horizon 2030 strategy and the research and development program, the aim of which is to position the agency for the future. As indicated, the webinar is part of the Foresight study project, which is within the research and development program, and which is looking at identifying trends and future scenarios which will assist in determining that desired future. Let's now watch the second introductory presentation by Dr. Chris Rust, which will give us some further background into the SANRAL Foresight project.
Welcome everyone. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the SANRAL Foresight project. The rationale for this project is that within a fast-changing world, accelerated by events such as COVID-19, SANRAL has decided to conduct a Foresight study for the South African transport sector that will envision how the transport sector will change. This study aims to develop several possible future scenarios, 10 to 15 years from now, that could be analyzed and stress tested to enlighten the possible development paths for the transport sector. This will then be used to provide input into future planning of the SANRAL R&D program. The objectives of the program are firstly to develop a description and analysis of the current state and reality of the transport sector in South Africa. Secondly, then to develop a description and analysis of potential future scenarios for the transport sector. And then to formulate the technologies, knowledge, capabilities, and capacity required to move the transport sector from the current reality to the desired future state. And then lastly, to provide input into the formulation of the future SANRAL R&D portfolio. So the approach of the project is depicted in this diagram. First of all, here on the left, we start in the yellow block, defining the drivers and the trends that will depict the current reality of the transport sector. We then jump into the future and we determine potential future scenarios for the transport sector. And based on those, we define the desired state for the transport sector in South Africa. Based on this, we then determine the key solutions that we need to develop to take us to that desired state. And then we actually determine the technology gaps and knowledge gaps that will bridge the gap between the current reality and these key solutions that will take us to the future and hence the desired state for the transport sector. So we are working from the future backwards. The activities in the project are therefore as follows. First of all, a desktop study to identify drivers, trends, technology horizons, and so on. Secondly, to obtain Eminent thinker inputs, of which this current webinar is one of the activities. Then followed by stakeholder workshops and a questionnaire to add information and prioritize drivers, trends, and technologies. To then develop potential scenarios and a desired future state for the transport sector. This is then followed by futures analysis and the definition of a network of activities to move us from the current reality to the desired future state. And finally, then to provide input, as I said, into the SANRAL R&D program to position it for the future of the transport sector and balance it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for clarifying the rationale behind the project, which will lead to the unpacking of several future scenarios, looking at the desired future state of the transport industry and the associated future planning. As you indicated, this webinar is a key input into the project. The Eminent Thinker videos we will now watch will focus on the scenarios for South Africa and the local aspects and include two pre-recorded interviews with firstly Dr. Yaki Salia from the Institute for Security Studies and secondly Mr. Nazir Ali, who's the president of the World Roads Congress, PIAC. Welcome to all of you viewing this Eminent Future Thinkers interview. My name is Paul Hendricks and I'll be conducting the interview and facilitating today's discussion. It's my great pleasure to welcome our Eminent Futures thinker today, Dr. Yaki Salia. Yaki is a well-known Africa analyst, he's an author and he's a popular commentator. Dr. Salia is the founder and former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies, where he now serves as chair of the Board of Trustees and head of the African Futures and Innovation Program. Dr. Salia is also an extraordinary professor in the Center of Human Rights and the Department of Political Sciences, the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Salia has presented numerous papers at conferences, seminars, and he's published several books on various matters relating to peace and security in Africa. His 2017 bestseller, Fate of the Nation, addresses South Africa's futures from political, economic, and social perspectives. And his two most recent books, Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution, which was published in March 2020, and The Future of Africa, Challenges and Opportunities, which was published in April 2021, take a rigorous look at the continent as a whole. Yaki, as such an eminent African futures thinker, practitioner, I'm looking forward to hearing your views on the different future scenarios that are available for South Africa. I really want to thank you for joining me today. Yaki, my first question then relates to political and socio-economic change. And I'd like to hear your views on what are the major political and socio-economic drivers of change in South Africa.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks for inviting me. I thought that I'd start off by playing a short video which we completed last year or the year before that, and that sort of sets the scene for where South Africa is headed and what could be possible.
The COVID-19 crisis has exposed South Africa's weak economic fundamentals. South Africa was already growing more slowly than its peers when the pandemic hit. Without deep structural reform, its average long-term growth rate is a miserly 1.9%. This is significantly below any rate that would alleviate poverty, reduce inequality, and grow employment. Two recent reports from the Institute for Security Studies use the International Futures Forecasting System to model and present an alternative aspirational vision for South Africa called Tumamina, or Send Me. The Tumamina scenario unlocks long-term growth by modeling the impact of transitions in health and education, resolving the electricity crisis to enable modern industrialization, and implementing rural land reform to transform livelihoods in the former homelands where poverty is endemic. More than half of South Africa's total population live in extreme poverty, surviving on an average income of less than $5.50 per person per day. Social grants alleviate the symptoms of suffering, but the only structural solution to the dilemma is job growth in the formal sector. That, in turn, requires sustained rapid economic growth over successive decades, and for that growth to be inclusive. President Cyril Ramaphosa has committed to use the coronavirus crisis as an opportunity to build a pro-growth social compact. This, combined with the implementation of evidence-based economic policies, could boost South Africa's economy to be almost 50% larger within 2 decades compared to the current growth forecast. Beyond determined leadership and significant government reform, the Tumamina pathway requires better management and efficiency in the public health sector, whilst lowering costs in the private sector. In education, South Africa must improve graduation rates, focus on quality, and invest in the skills for the fourth industrial revolution. In energy, the country must pursue a least-cost energy solution predicated on renewables and shift away from fossil fuels. In manufacturing, South Africa must invest more in research and development, accelerate the expansion of information and communications technology infrastructure, and promote value-added goods for export to the African market. In agriculture, the country must support land and smallholder agricultural reform in the former homelands by providing tenure security. In addition, it must support commercial agriculture, reduce food waste, and improve water management. None of this is possible without a forward-looking pro-growth social compact combined with the implementation of evidence-based economic policies. Read the full report on the ISS website at www.issafrica.org.
What I would like to do is I've got a few slides to speak about with regard to the current situation. Looking at sort of the major political and socioeconomic drivers for change in South Africa, I think at the moment the biggest impediment to growth in South Africa is really political. It's the divisions within the ANC, in the extent to which efforts at maintaining party unity spills over into other sectors while constraining its ability to provide national leadership. So unlocking the kind of growth that we were modeling in the previous little video, that's essentially at the challenge. And politically, what happens this year within the ANC is really going to be substantive. It's the largest party by a substantial margin, but the challenges of factionalism within the party really has become of national concern. We must bear in mind that the events in 2022 to a degree mirror what happened in 2017 when Ramaphosa was elected, and there was this massive fight supported by a significant amount of taxpayers' money that was routed through the intelligence and other agencies in what was a murderous campaign eventually. Now, the taps of money have been turned off, but we will see an intense contestation this year. But the basic issue is if we're not unable to grow more rapidly, inequality and poverty and unemployment could really over the medium long term come to overwhelm South Africa. And what has become evident since July of last year when we had the riots in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng is that the ability of the security agencies to manage this have deteriorated. Although, as I've said, the taps of illegal money have been turned off. So South Africa, lots of potential, but increasingly the challenges of poor governance, bad policy, incompetence and corruption really bedevil the country. And in this year to next year, if we don't resolve our electricity crisis, of course, it remains a cap of, what is it, about 1% of GDP growth. So our analysis would, and that was reflected in the video that I showed you, because you remember that the video starts with social capital, with human capital. And that is our largest drag on growth. If you look at South Africa's indices on life expectancy, it's about 12 years below the average of comparable countries globally, upper middle income countries. Now, infant mortality rates are about 3 times higher. We have an incredibly population with incredibly bad health indices. Yet the irony is that we have a demographic dividend. Median age in South Africa is about 27 years, which means that we have a very large proportion of working age people to dependents. The problem is they don't have jobs. So we should be growing much more rapidly, but we aren't. Our schooling levels are very high, but quality is very low. Crime and violence, as we all know, is a big drag, not only on that, but also on investor confidence, which follows from many of the indices above. And South Africa has a very small informal sector by comparative international standards for a country with the levels of inequality, unemployment that we have, and that's certainly set to expand into the future. And it's also one of the ways in which South Africa can mediate some of our population that is not in employment and not economically active. But on the other hand, we have a small agricultural sector that provides food security for South Africa and into the region, which has enabled South Africa to survive during the COVID crisis better than perhaps most realized. And we have good infrastructure, but it is deteriorating very rapidly, which I think cuts very much to the essence of SANRAL's challenges. So a long answer to your first question, I'm afraid.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Yagi. Yagi, can I ask you had a point there around policy. How much is due to poor policy as opposed to lack of implementation?
I think it's both, which is of course the easy answer, but we have a plethora of first world regulations and constraints in our economy, and a parliament that institutes the one regulatory requirement upon the other, but our ability to manage that lags far behind. If you speak to foreigners, their ability to work and do business in South Africa, to get permits, to jump through our very onerous Black economic empowerment regulations and so on, are huge. We have a very cumbersome state instead of a developmental state. The state and the regulatory burden in South Africa is one of the short-term successes that we just don't seem able to turn around. We should really be focusing on the ease of doing business and removing the massive amount of regulatory burdens that are sometimes outdated. So there is that. On the other hand, there has also been many instances of bad policy, and for me, always the best example, goes back a few years, is to turn to the institution of outcomes-based education in South Africa, which really literally destroyed the educational system, and it's taken a decade to recover from that. And we can look at every sector. There are not only instances of poor implementation, but there are really instances of bad and wrong policy. You can look at, for example, within the area that I do a lot of work in, also the broad security area, where there's been lots of good policy, but there's been also bad policy. And there's also been just abysmal implementation.
Thanks, Haki. Then moving on, given then our current trajectory, what will South Africa's political scenarios look like then in 10 to 15 years? And how do you think it will impact on security, stability, and foreign investment?
So you were kind enough to share the questions ahead of time. So I've prepared, as with the previous one, a little bit of a presentation on that. So here is a sort of a scenario of events in 2022. Let's start on the left-hand side. This is going to be a turbulent year for South Africa. We're heading for the ANC's 55th elective conference in December 2022, at which the governing party, which is far and away the majority party in South Africa, is going to elect a new president and deputy president. But in the run-up to that, the ANC will have regional, provincial conferences, a national policy conference, and the party is hugely divided, not only between two large factions, let's call them the RAT and the CR22 factions, CR22, Cyril Ramaphosa 22, RAT, Radical Economic Transformation. Is a top block that makes the point that, you know, the ANC is large. It will remain the largest party probably beyond and even into the 2029 elections. But increasingly voters are staying away from the party. They're just not prepared to vote for the ANC, particularly black urban voters. So its support base is becoming much more rural. And so you have an interesting tension that is developing between the rural support base of the ANC and the president, who is much more urban orientated, modern orientated, and which is where he wants to take the ANC. So the ANC is very much characterized by weak leadership, by factionalism, by lack of accountability, corruption, poor service delivery, and it's absolutely consumed by infighting. So instead of spending, let's say, 20% on ANC business and 80% on running the country, the president's probably spending 80% on running the factions within the ANC and 20% on running the country. And the problem is that the opposition can't really capitalize on this. They can't capitalize on the disaffection. The DA has moved rightward. It's in threat of becoming a regional party. EFF is possibly at a ceiling because it gains from the disaffection within the ANC. We don't know where Action SA is going to be, but there does seem to be a bit of an IFP resurgence in KwaZulu-Natal. But that's possibly just linked to the fact that they've lost their president, Jacob Zuma. So there are four scenarios that I'm very briefly going to discuss and present to you that are called from earlier work that I've done, Bafana Bafana, Tumamina, Mandela Magic, and Nation Divided. They are in order of probability. So Bafana Bafana, which is named after our national soccer team, is really the most likely scenario. And this is where Ramaphosa wins, but the ANC remains divided. There's no party split in December 2022. So what happens, and these are just forecasts, they are not, ANC perhaps gets about 48% nationally in 2024, and in 2029 it gets about 43%, but it governs as the leader, as the largest party in coalition with the one or two smaller parties. It loses Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal to opposition coalitions, and eventually the Free State. And it is our governing party probably till 2034. That's the most likely scenario, largely because of the inability of the opposition to get their act going. Second scenario is that you have a decisive win for the Ramaphosa faction, and that that the RAT faction splinters off, and that the ANC revitalizes under President Ramaphosa, so it retains its national majority, 51%, 53%, 29%. It even keeps Gauteng. The splinter of the RAT faction maybe joins the EFF and becomes the official opposition. Sort of a second. It's much less likely than the first one. Then the other two is that something else that may happen is that the RAT faction wins, maybe somebody like Lindiwe Sisulu as the main contender, and that Ramaphosa leads a split, and if he leads a split from the party, which is very unlikely, the ANC tanks, and ironically Ramaphosa probably could retain presidency of the country as the leader of a governing coalition. And you see the rest of the ANC entering into an EFF alliance. Unlikely, but it's a possibility. And the last is the least likely scenario, where the RET faction wins, ANC remains united but loses support. There's no split in the party, but you have somebody, as I said, like Lindiwe Sisulu, or somebody who governs. But the ANC will then really struggle at the elections, and the opposition parties will do much better. You end up with a complex coalition, governing coalitions, while the ANC loses Gauteng and KZN in 2024 and possibly the Free State in 2029. So these are alternative scenarios. The most likely is the Bafana scenario. Perhaps less likely is Tumamina, or some combination of Bafana and Tumamina. Much less likely are scenarios where the RET faction wins in South Africa, and South Africa then ends up in that scenario with a opposition alliance probably governing the country. So that sort of forecasts scenarios for the medium long-term future politically of South Africa.
Thank you, Yaki. Yaki, can I just ask? I mean, you mentioned that Bafana scenario is the likely one. Is that what the heart is telling us, or what the data and where we're heading? It'd be great to be honest on this, and so appreciate that. Yeah.
No, I think it is the most likely scenario. I think that it's either, if we are lucky, then Ramaphosa wins, and he brings in his candidate as a preferred deputy president. That could be somebody like Phumzile Ngcuka, which would be a sort of a combination of the scenarios, and you would find a slow but steady turnaround of the ANC, which is sort of something in between Bafana and Tumamina. Yeah. And that's what I think is probably the most realistic. Now, what is important is that the work that is being done behind the scenes to turn the South African economy around, like reform in the Office of the Auditor General, the capacitating of the NPA, the Zuma Commission, all of these kind of things, they take a long time to have effect, but they have significant structural effect over the medium long term. So South Africa's prospects have really become much more positive. What worries me is that the pressure on South Africa, from instability, violence is rising. And if Ramaphosa does not pay sufficient attention to reform of police intelligence, the ability to maintain law and order in South Africa, given our levels of unemployment, inequality and poverty, may overwhelm our ability, and that is increasingly becoming a concern.
Thanks, Ryan. Perhaps one other thing, and your feelings around the current state of our institutions. Are you becoming a bit more positive in terms of the rebuilding of those institutions, or what's your view?
I'm becoming more positive because I think that the example of what happened with SARS, the turnaround that we saw with SARS, demonstrates what is possible. If that same commitment can be brought to other departments, and the Zondo Commission has really exposed what has gone wrong. The challenge that we have is that our response to many of these issues is to increase the regulatory burden and not to appoint competent, permanent, skilled people. Now that is a function of trying to rebalance the racial composition of our economy and our politics. It's understandable, but we've gone completely overboard with that. Ramaphosa needs to appoint capable people from within departments to manage those departments. Now he has made it very evident that he is going to embark on the professionalization of the South African civil service. Now, if you look at these scenarios, some of them are quite alarming. I know that. But one of the ways to respond to this, and the ANC and the governing party, in their own interests, particularly as South Africa heads to coalition territory which is our future, whichever all these scenarios end up with one exception of coalition governments and some. If you want government to work, you have to insulate the civil service from political interference. And if there's one thing that the Zondo Commission have taught us, is the challenges of political appointments within government and cadre deployment within government. And I think that that lesson really has come home.
Oh, thanks for that. Some positive notes there. Thank you, Aki. Okay, if we can look a bit further afield, the third question I've got for you relates to international and regional future trends. I'd just like to find out from you which are the future global and regional trends you think will directly impact on our country's future.
So I prepared quite a bit of material on the stuff that we've spoken about. So, and I work internationally to quite an extent, but I've not prepared a few slides or anything like that. I thought I'll just offer a few ideas, and I think that we are, of course, rapidly heading to a process of normalization after COVID, but globally, the dominant trend is the shift of power and influence from west to east, and the rise of China, and at the same time, eventually the rise of India, and collectively you see power and economic dominance shifting to Asia. The main threat with that is that you have two nuclear armed states that share a border and that are in competition with one another. So that shift is one part of the storyline. The second part of the storyline is increased fractionalism. The world is fracturing, not in the gas sense of the word, but fault lines are emerging within democracies and globally. Countries are struggling to maintain coherence. Democracy is under threat in the West and everywhere. But in Africa, the thrust towards democratization remains, because we've had the experience of poor governance and all of these issues. So we are just finishing a large project where we look at economic futures of the continent. And Africa's future is bright, but a lot needs to happen. South Africa's obvious market and partner is Africa. It's the only area where we have a competitive advantage. We are well positioned in Southern Africa. We are supposed to be a growth engine in the region. We are not. We're actually a bit of a drag on growth. But Africa and the African Continental Free Trade Area presents South Africa with significant potential. And in particular, if we can do what the Chinese did, which is do our own Belt and Road Initiative in Southern Africa, that's what we should be doing, so that we can really benefit from the Continental Free Trade Area, which, when we lose scenario work, is over long-term horizons, has the most growth potential in Africa, more than any other scenario. It even surpasses a manufacturing or industrialization transition in its long-term impact, because it itself transforms economies, because the value add of local of trade with your neighbors is often higher than international trade, and things that you guys probably know much more about than I. So these are sort of divergent trends and issues that point to the potential of Africa and South Africa in Africa, but a lot needs to be done. Because the current trend is that things are improving in Africa, but it's improving more slowly than in the rest of the world. And over long-term horizons, the impact of climate change can really forestall many of the changes that need to happen on the continent.
Thanks, Aki. Makes total sense. If you know, we've spoken a bit about policy, Aki, but perhaps from your perspective, any major local interventions or policy changes that you think will be required as we move ahead to take us forward?
Well, I think I've hopefully in South Africa, I've hinted at some of this, which is really about the regulatory burden, simplification and focusing on the ease of doing business and so on and so forth. Many of these issues really relate to consequence management. There is, of course, matters that relate to a more flexible labour market and so on and so forth. These are well known. I mean, there is an actual fact. What needs to happen in South Africa is well documented. The only challenge is that government doesn't seem to do that, or it does that under Ramaphosa, but it moves extremely slowly. But I have no specific recommendations in your field that I feel competent enough to be able to offer advice on.
Okay, no, thanks, Jackie. Just, if I can just carry on talking about the transport field, any opportunities or pitfalls for South Africa relating to transport collaboration and partnerships in Africa with your experience and globally?
Not really that I feel competent to be able to respond to. I'm not a transport expert, and I felt I'd rather steer away from that than delve into areas where I could really create a challenge for myself.
Okay. If I can bring you back, you had a very good point around infrastructure and maintenance earlier. Do you just want to say a bit more about that, because that was like manna from heaven when I heard that.
Yeah, I actually did a slide on that, so I'm gonna share that with you, because for me this really is absolutely important, because one of the last issues you asked was what issue did you want to add, and I looked at SANRAL's vision and mission. Fantastic, and I just said, you need to maintain and optimize our existing road infrastructure. South Africa, our infrastructure is falling apart. And it is falling apart at every level. It is the one big advantage that we used to have across South Africa. And to the extent that I understand anything about your sector, but that for us is absolutely critical. We are losing day by day one of our most important advantages when it comes to growth in Africa. So that's my 5 cents worth.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must say, on behalf of our Technology Foresight project team, just thank you for joining us today and sharing your insightful views. Thanks for going to the trouble to put together a really interesting presentation and sharing those views with us. So, Jackie, thank you very much.
For a pleasure.
Welcome to all of you viewing this Eminent Future Thinkers interview. My name is Phil Hendricks, and I'll be conducting the interview and facilitating today's discussion. It's my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished futures thinker, Mr. Nazir Ali, who is the newly elected president of the World Road Association, PIAC. Now, PIAC was founded as a non-profit, non-political association in 1909 with the goal of organizing the exchange of knowledge on all matters related to roads and road transport. PIAC boasts 3,000 members in 142 countries, including 122 government members worldwide, and holds consultative status to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Nazir Ali is a chartered civil engineer who has a 40-year history in the civil engineering and project finance fields. Nazir was the first CEO of the South African National Roads Agency, SANRAL, where he modernized South Africa's road network to world-class standards for 17 years. Under his leadership, SANRAL's road network grew from 7,200 kilometers in 1998 to 21,403 kilometers, and the organization won numerous global awards in engineering excellence. Nazir is a fellow of the South African Institution of Civil Engineers. He's a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers of the UK and of the Institute of Directors, and is a fellow of the South African Academy of Engineers. He has authored several papers and he's presented on various topics at international and local conferences and seminars. He was instrumental in developing the concept of PPPs, or public-private partnerships, here in South Africa, which culminated in the acclaimed Maputo Development Corridor. And under his guidance, SANRAL sponsored chairs in road engineering at a number of South African universities. Nazir, now sort of semi-retired, still consults for the World Bank as a globally recognized leader in PPPs and as an international advisor on transport systems, institutional reform, contract models, as well as economic infrastructure policy and the development of rural roads. Nazir, it's really good to see you again. I'm looking forward to hearing discussion, listening to your views on South Africa's future scenarios, and I'm sure you'll bring your deep insights and experience of our transport system and your extensive international experience to bear. My first question, Nazir, is very broad. I'd like you to give your views on how you think transport will change internationally in the next 10 to 15 years, and what are some of the associated challenges?
Thanks for the opportunity, Phil, and for the introduction. I'm not sure where you got it, but thank you. Well, look, how do we see transport changing? Look, transport will change in many ways, especially in the operation side of the transport and that, yeah. And we got to make sure that the infrastructure that we provide for the transport, for the operations of the transport, you know, it's concomitant with what is required for that. Meaning to say that how do we adapt the roads to provide the services that they will? And, you know, I sort of colloquially talk about this thing saying that how is the road going to talk to the vehicle? It's not the vehicle talking to itself. It's not, you know, EVs around, let's say electric vehicles and that. But how do we adapt the road to make sure that, you know, it is connected in a means of communication with the vehicle? One. Secondly, I believe that a lot of our roads that we've got, apart from the materials, you know, that will be changing, and various advances have already been made in the type of materials that we use, especially around recycling, and the materials that we thought in the past were not this thing good enough to use for road building. Those materials will be used with various kind of, want of a better term, additives put into it, let me put it that way, or strength enhanced, yeah, of the material. So we'll be doing a lot of that going into the future. But also the maintenance of these roads. How do we make sure that we maintain the roads? You know, for instance, if we're going to have a plethora of instrumentation, either alongside the road or embedded into the road surface itself, how are we going to maintain that? Are we going to every time, you know, dig the thing up and redo it, everything? Or is a lot of things going to be done remotely? Yeah, remotely in the sense that without physical copper wires, for argument's sake, going into the road. Yeah, how do we do that? That's the way that I see that transport will change in a big way. Yeah, of course we know that the vehicles are changing already. You know, the drive towards EVs, for instance. Yeah, the reduction of fossil fuels. Use of fossil fuels in our vehicles, and that's already taking place. How do we, as a road construction industry or profession, contribute to the reduction of the carbon footprint? And again, I think the materials in that we'll be using will be playing a major role in assisting that. So I see big changes coming in over a period of time. I see big changes coming in. I don't think that these things will happen overnight. It takes time. It takes a lot of research and development to take place as well. And I'd like to believe that our universities and institutions like the CSIR in South Africa will be playing a leading role in research and development of this. I'd like to believe that, because South African technology, road building technology, yeah, is highly respected around the world. It's always been recognized as one of the leaders as far as road technologies is concerned in the provision of that infrastructure. And I'd like to believe that we will continue to play that significant role in the R&D of the development of road infrastructure going forward in South Africa. Thank you.
Ziri, if I can just touch on, you mentioned, one of the challenges being the carbon footprint issue, reduction in carbon footprint. You've mentioned the state of, our research institutions, etc. Do you see our resource challenges coming to bear, or is it an issue that worries you?
Well, I think we must think, separate this to when we're talking about resources, right? Are we talking about the human capital that we require from the physical sort of materials that go out to build the thing? And of course, there's the third component as well, which is the funding issue, because that is the resources. Well, and where do the funds come from? As far as the materials are concerned in that, right? The advances which are already been made, I think we'll be fine. I believe that we'll be fine, and I'm hoping that our research institutions and universities don't stop doing the work that they're already doing in that. Yeah, because one is occasionally I still read some of the stuff, technical stuff coming out, and it's very heartening to see that. Yeah, from our research. When I look at the involvement of academia, South African academia, in international events, etc., and that it's very heartening to see that as well. In terms of that, shows that there is, thinking coming out around it, and there's research being done about it, new ideas coming in. There's an adaptation of the materials that at one time they would have said that we can't use for road building taking place. Yeah, that is already taking place. So that's good. Then there's the issue about human capital. Yeah. Now, we need to acknowledge the fact that our universities are still doing an excellent job in terms of producing the graduates that we require, the skills that we require. Our challenge still remains, as far as the input into the universities. So that means I'm talking about the high school level qualifications, etc. in terms of that. And again, let's say fingers crossed, there's a lot of talk in South Africa right now of reviewing the whole curriculum, etc., the school curriculum, and better preparation of the students going into university. Yeah. So I don't have an issue with our universities, and I think our universities will always remain where they are. I do sincerely believe that. Yeah. And produce the caliber of the students. Our main challenge, our big challenge is how do we retain that? Because when I look at, and it's mainly anecdotal, I haven't looked at the numbers, though the numbers are available. Even anecdotally, it is a bit disconcerting to see the talent that we're losing, young talent that we lose from South Africa to other countries and that. And that's a debate on its own.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's a debate on its own as to how do we retain the talent within South Africa? What do we do? Because it's not only about education and salaries. That's a much broader debate as to why do people go and look for greener pastures elsewhere. Maybe the grass is not as sweet as they thought it would be on this side till you go and taste the grass on the other side. So that's, as I said, a debate for another day that we can have. Then there's the issue around funding. I don't believe that there's necessarily a shortage of funding. And when I talk about funding, I talk both people paying directly for the use of the service, the application of the user pay principle, which has always been done very selectively as far as the roads is concerned in South Africa. If you look around it, if you look at the total kilometers of roads that we have in South Africa and the number of kilometers of roads that people pay for directly for. Yeah, it's a very small amount. It's a very, very small amount that they do that, and that is a major contribution as well to the upkeep of the road network over there. But how well do we use that budget? Whether it is the directly paid for revenue or the revenue which comes from government itself. How well do we use the thing? That is where we need to apply our minds into making sure that there is real value for money. And I don't mean by value for money, we sometimes got a habit to say value for money, We do an estimate, the job costs, the project costs 10 Rand. We take something out and it suddenly costs 7 Rand and we think, hey, you know, that's value for money. But what you've done is that you've cut the project. You haven't added in any value to this thing. So one has to be mindful about how do we define value for money in our sector. And the application of those funding resources, to me, is the real challenge, and how well do we. And again, you can see the nexus between the funding that you're doing on the one side, the planning that you're doing, the maintenance of your roads, and the type of materials that you're going to use, and how the road is going to be communicating with the user of the road.
Fantastic, thank you, Nazir. That's very clear. So given then that the vision of the changes we expect to see to the international sort of transport systems, what do you think are some of the drivers and trends that will cause this change, Nazir?
Well, you see, the drivers basically will be, of course, the advancements already been made in the vehicle technology. You know, it seems to me that when I look around internationally, what's happening, the driver is basically the technology, even the maintenance of our roads and our bridges, etc. Right? A lot of it is driven by technology. You know, at one time, many years ago, we'd, for instance, walk the road, as we always said, walk the road to go and do a visual inspection of the roads. These days, you don't do that. There's instrumentation that you use, there's software that you use, you understand? Vehicles drive at 80 kilometers per hour, surveying the condition of the road, for instance, and picking up a huge amount of information and data. I should say data, because not turning data into information is useless. It's how do we use the data, which is another issue as well that one has to be mindful of. So I'm saying it's technology which is driving these changes over there, and we need to keep up with that. I mean, I've seen, for instance, how drones are used these days, you know, to inspect bridges, you know, that you can't reach easily, and that's the type of stuff which is driving the changes which are happening in our sector. And of course, one can turn around and say, of course, the advances been made in the type of materials also we use, and I come back to that because without reusing our materials, we can't see then the connection between reducing the carbon footprint. It's well and good for me to turn around and say, yes, I'm going to drive an electric vehicle, but if I don't take into account how was that energy produced for me to drive that electric vehicle? So we need to look at these connections as well, the connectivity between this, as to how we do that. That I believe is what is driving the changes. Now, of course, there's a debate in terms of how much of the drivers are actually initiated by the road building industry itself. Now, I believe in the way that we construct the roads, there's a lot of stuff happening there as well. In South Africa, for various reasons, we don't make use of all the technology. Let me just use a simple example of the number of roller passes that we have, you know, when we're compacting our materials, right? There is technology around and has been for quite a while now already, that people will use to see that once the color changes and depending on how well the compaction is, depending on what type of materials you're using, etc., to say, okay, I've done enough passes on this particular layer, and that I don't have to rely on the experience of the foreman to say, all right, one more pass, or okay, that's sufficient in that. So it's also the use of the technology. But in civil engineering, I believe that our technology is incremental, so we don't always notice it. We're not in the IT business that you notice, you know? So it's incremental. The use of BIM, for argument's sake, that's a technology as well, in terms of, again, having better communications with the designers on the one side and the constructors on the other side over there. And BIM plays a major role of that. I've spoken to a number of contractors, and I see in South Africa, and I see slowly they're starting to use it, but not to the same extent as perhaps has been used in other parts of the world. There is use. But also we need to be very mindful that with the advancements with the technologies and the use of technologies, what do we do with the people who are not trained in that particular field? What do we do? How do we make sure that we do not inadvertently create further unemployment? And I come back. That's just the thunder you're hearing there. For I think we in for a storm. The unemployment, right? That we don't inadvertently create further unemployment. So it's very important for us, both from the educational side and the training side, because it's always been my contention that the civil engineering industry is very well placed to reduce the unemployment, especially amongst those, the semi-skilled and the unskilled. You know, we talk about the unemployment, high rate of unemployment in South Africa, but if you look at it, there's a shortage of skills as well. You know, in our sector, in our sector, right? So we have this dual challenge. On the one side, as to how do we create more employment? So is the use of technology going to be our answer? Without tackling the issue around training and that, and being mindful of the unemployment as well. So we have those challenges in our country, which probably in other parts of the world they don't have, but in our country I believe that we definitely have those challenges.
Thank you, Nazir. Very important point you brought up there. If you know, you've touched on South Africa, but what are some of the sort of important aspects for transport here in South Africa that you think is going to be important to Zero, and what role can it play in our development? You've already mentioned the issues around, you know, the new technologies and related to, you know, leaving a large tranche of people behind and the concerns about that. But what role do you believe transport can play in our development here?
Look, transport, right, is a backbone of the economy. Yeah, you can't this thing have an economy without good transport connectivity. And I'm talking across the all sectors, whether it is road-based transport, rail-based transport, or the water-based, you know, shipping or air transport. Yeah, and I think shipping together with the surface-based transport plays a far more critical role in the economy than just the air transport. But that's a personal view that I have in a whole. Yeah. So what are these things that the changes that I see? What we need to be able to do is make sure that we have the logistics chain, something that we need to look at very carefully. We got to see the different roles of the different parts of that logistic chain, whether it's road-based transport or rail-based transport. Rail-based transport is very, very important. You know, for many years, people have said, oh, why do you talk and support rail-based transport when you're running a roads agency or was running a roads agency? Yeah, the people don't understand that there's a connection between the two. There's a certain type of freight, for instance, just does not belong on the road. Full stop. The long hauls that we have, you know, it's unfortunate that our rail sector is not up to scratch as we want to. And it's also further exacerbated by the fact that commuters are paying far more to get from point A to point B, because our rail system, again, has collapsed. I mean, let's call a spade over here. It has collapsed. Yeah. So they're ending up using road-based transport and road-based transport is more expensive than rail-based transport is. Yeah. And also road-based transport, you know, has a higher impact on, again, the carbon footprint than the rail-based transport would have as well. We need to factor in these things over there. And that is what I believe is going to be the changes coming. And it's very important to us to bring in these changes, especially as far as commuter traffic is concerned, or commuter transportation is concerned. Yeah. We need to make it much more efficient than it is. We need to make sure that it's available as and when required, and it must be affordable. You can't be spending something like 10% of your income just to get to work and back home. Yeah, it's just far too expensive. Notwithstanding everything, all the other expenses that we have. So let's assume that everything else being equal, the fact that we're spending. Now we've been talking about reducing the cost of transport way back since 1994, and we haven't done well at all in it. So we need to relook at that in terms of how do we make that contribution to reducing the cost of commuter transport specifically, which also will have an impact on freight, on the movement of freight and that, so it has all of these linkages. That whole logistics chain is linked, one is linked to the other, and the value at the end of it is what we got to be aiming for. And not just to say that, road is cheaper than rail or the other way around, and then there's a little bit of a value in the middle, but the end product is still too high. So we look at that entire chain because we want to make sure that the end product is what we want, and that is what our concentration should be on.
Okay. Jim, if I can, you've got a tremendous international experience. You've traveled a lot. Any emerging country you want us to look at? I mean, you spoke about the logistics chain, the integration, the collaboration between the modes, the fact that, listen, we need to bring rail or public transport to an affordable, efficient level. Who's doing it very well at the moment, from your experience and, perhaps from PR?
Look, I see pockets of excellence around the world. Let me put it that way. Yeah, I see pockets of excellence around the world. But also, let me put in a disclaimer immediately over here. I've not studied the full logistics chains in these countries. So that's how I'm saying I see pockets of excellence. Yeah, and I see pockets of excellence in some parts of India, for argument's sake. I've seen pockets of excellence in Indonesia. I've seen that in Nigeria. I've seen that in Tanzania. So you see these pockets of excellence. Of course, Brazil has always stood out as a pocket of excellence for us as well in that part of the world. I've seen it in Chile as well. Yeah.
Nazir, you've mentioned, India, Nigeria, some of these countries that you've seen real pockets of excellence. What has made the difference? Has it been political will? Has it been, just the acceptance of really good technology, the willingness to look at new ideas?
Well, what I've seen is a mixture of things, of course, yeah. It's a mixture of things. I mean, what I found fascinating in how they regulated the taxi industry in Lagos. Yeah. It's an excellent study to look at, yeah. How they regulated it, how they brought it in and reduced the chaos, for instance, in the city of Lagos. And parts of India and some of the states, what also I found quite fascinating, although the buses are old and etc. That's a different issue. But how they run on time, right? How the buses run on time. That's very important. They don't have fancy technology showing you the bus is doing 5 minutes or 2 minutes, etc., and all of that. And how the rural areas are served with their public transport. Yeah. So I'm saying that's why I'm saying by pockets of excellence. Then, of course, you find in places like recently in Tanzania, and for quite a while now in places like Brazil and Chile, where they've reorganized the whole transport system, the layout of the cities, etc. So their whole, urban planning in an urban context. No? Urban planning plays a major role in terms of how do we do that, etc. I mean, I don't mean to be critical of the city I live in, and I see the way they're putting in the BRT. Yeah, but given the issues around safety, and I'm talking about physical safety here now, I can show you parts of what they've done over there. There's no way that if when the hijacking is taking place or something, you can get away from it. So the planners haven't thought about it. The designers haven't thought about that aspect at all. Nothing wrong with the structure of the road and so forth, but they haven't thought about it to say that, we're living in times which unfortunately are not very pleasant. Yeah, they're not very pleasant in the current situation as far as crime is concerned. So our design needs to take that into account as well. We don't. Yeah, I'm not saying that those other countries have necessarily taken that into account because they don't face the same challenges as we do. But, you know, I was just mentioning some of the pockets of excellence that I've seen, and there's been a mixture of why they have been successful in how they're running their systems, etc. and so forth. And of course, the major role I believe that civil society itself plays as well in making sure that things happen the way that we want it to, or we'd like to, I should say.
No, thank you, Nazir. Nazir, in terms of, you've mentioned quite a bit about technology, but are there any emerging technologies or process that you're excited about that you feel will really shape the future of transport?
Yeah, look, as I said, you know, I'm quite excited with the number of technologies that I've seen. Yeah, and again, I talk about the materials. I mean, I've seen some of the advances being made in materials in that. Yeah, the use of drones to do various kind of stuff over there. The use of other fancy equipment that even we had at SANRAL. You know, in terms of how we were doing the road condition surveys, etc., and how we brought in the greater use of technology to be able to survey the road conditions. How do we then transform the data into information, which then had a direct impact on how we budgeted the expenditure. Yeah, how we budgeted the expenditure with maintenance, you know, being foremost in our minds always, and first cut was always for maintenance, and then everything else that came in over there, right? I mean, I saw the other day, right? I was part of a seminar that I attended, yeah, as part of the PIAC had run. Yeah, I mean, Intel. I didn't even know that Intel. You know, we know Intel as a chip manufacturer, yeah, but they got a vehicle, right, with their chip in, etc., and all of that business, which does road condition survey. And it's not even one of these fancy laser technology and that. And I couldn't exactly understand because, you know, they just showed you snippets on this thing. So how does that vehicle work? Yeah. So those are the kind of things which are exciting me in terms of what is driving the changes in our sector. And whether we like it or not, we will have to embrace those. Yeah. And again, the application of it and how do we use it in our context, in our specific context, plays a major role and will be important.
So, Nazir, any that you think we shouldn't waste time and bring in almost immediately, that it could make a major difference without, you know, impacting in terms of some of the consequences you mentioned earlier here in South Africa? Is there any that you think how that, let's look at that immediately?
I would start looking at two things. Again, one, as I said, the materials, right? And the second thing is the communications between the road and the car. How do we adapt the road, yeah, to do this? I mean, we know that a number of vehicle manufacturers are already bringing it in an EV. Now, I accept internationally as well, the sale of EVs is low compared to everything else. But I believe that will go like our laptops, etc., where the prices will start dropping. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, from what I read, and somebody who's already involved in this was telling me, yeah, from the PIAC guys, is that you take a vehicle, right, which is EV now, yeah. The mechanics, as you and I know, will be a thing of the past. Yeah. You'll just drive in, they'll replace a component, and you'll drive out. Yeah. So I mean, those guys, their futures, yeah. Are we training? Do we still need to train mechanics for argument's sake? Sure. And we got to take a view to say that we're going to be there in 20 years' time. So yes, we still need to train them. But what do we do afterward? So in answer to your question, Phil, I'd look at the technologies for the adaptation of our road to become part of the overall system that I see happening in the future.
Yeah. No, thank you. Very clear there, Nazir. Nazir, before we end off, are there any other issues you may want to add? Something we haven't mentioned?
Yeah, look, I think that what we need to concentrate as well is institutional capacity. Yeah. institutional capacity is extremely important, because if you don't have institutional capacity, you can't run a system or an organization by outsourcing everything. Of course, outsourcing is a role in this as well, and a major role to play in there. But you should never, in my mind, outsource the conceptualization and the decision making. The thinking that comes in over there. And it's like, for instance, when we introduced the electronic toll collection system. When we did the Maputo Development Corridor, that was 96, 97. We didn't have ETC. We didn't know how ETC operates or anything. But you can go and look at the documents that we produced then. It's a one-liner. When we have ETC, US concessionaires will also introduce it. That's all we have, one-liner. Maybe there's 2 sentences in there, but there's not even a full 5-sentence paragraph in the thing. That's all we had in all the concessions. But that's what I'm talking about, the foresight that we had at that time, to say that the advances are going to be made in terms of how do we collect the revenue by causing the least amount of disruption to the flow of the traffic and all the other benefits that come out of that in terms of stop, start, etc. and so forth over there. Right? How do we do that? How do we make sure that the monies that have been collected go directly into the appropriate concessionaires, to the appropriate concessionaires, as to whose road you drive, or whether it was into SANRAL account in that. When we introduced the Gauteng Freeway Improvement and the open road tolling system in South Africa, as this thing controversial as it still is, unfortunately, right, because of the lack of political will, and it being used as a political ball by people who I believe are not interested in building the economy of South Africa. It was the first interoperable system in the world. Nobody talks about that. Of course, the other people then came in later on and started to use, and they jumped ahead of us simply because, like all of this type of technology, you leapfrog the thing. But the fact that one tag, works, whether I'm driving in Cape Town through the tunnel at Huguenot, or I'm driving between Johannesburg and Pretoria, everything is recorded in one place. Now, if this thing sort of if the politics didn't come and interfere in that, right, we'd have been able to use that particular technology to put on your driver's license over there, your ID, a whole lot of other things, and use it for parking, etc., and so forth as well. Unfortunately, we've lost that opportunity. So the institutional capacity to be able to do what I've said is very, very important in my opinion.
No, thank you for that, Nazir. Nazir, we could carry on talking for a long time, but we've come to the end of the interview, and I'd just like to, on behalf of the Technology Foresight Project team and the South African National Road Agency, SANRAL, thank you really for sharing your views. They've been insightful and they've been backed up with your broad experience. And I just want to thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Well,
thank you. Some interesting and fascinating insights from our eminent speakers. And once again, thank you to Dr. Salir and Mr. Nazir Ali for their valued participation. Now, please don't forget to pose your comments and questions on the chat box. And as I said, they'll be answered in a blog, and the webinar recordings will be available on a YouTube channel afterwards. The details regarding access to the recordings and the blog and the YouTube channel will be emailed to you. If you don't receive an email and you're a bit worried about it, just check on the SANRAL website. The details will also be on the website. It's always good to see that we've got some questions already in the chat box, and let's just look at some of these. The first one I saw was from Jay Moya asking, can we have the recording? And of course, as I've indicated, those webinar recordings will be available on the YouTube channel. Then another question from Jay Moya, can we look deeply into the magic of Indonesia developments to apply the same in our economy? And you'll be happy to note that Mr. Ali made special reference to some of the interesting developments taking place in Indonesia. Further question from Chris Rust. Chris asked, Mr. Ali, what are some of the major technological drivers in the transport sector and how likely will they be implemented in South Africa? And then two questions that came through whilst Mr. Ali was speaking, the one from Mark Zaidgist. Dear Mr. Ali, Nazir, thank you for your kind words on the South African universities. You have, as the chair indicated, contributed tremendously to supporting transport research across the country, including my own chair at the University of Cape Town, for which I am forever grateful. The future of our field is increasingly interdisciplinary, with more and more inputs from computer, data sciences, electronic engineering, but also sociological, environmental sciences, etc. Yet our undergraduate curricula are constrained by requirements of EXA, but also because our degrees are general degrees. We can't afford specialized undergraduate degrees. What is your view on BSc Civil Engineering curricula in South African universities, and where would you start transforming the curriculum to be up to date with the developments that you spoke about? Mark, thank you for that. That will certainly be answered by Mr. Ali. Then we've got a question from Justice Chakwe. Nazir, what should be the focus on improving the roads for connected autonomous vehicles rather than the other way around? i.e., do we require OEMs to build vehicles for our dominant reality? And then there's one from Olivia Naidu as well. The volume of our road freight vehicles constantly increasing on our road networks. This presents many risks, including the added risk of crashes, as well as premature degradation of the road networks due to chronic overloading. The RTMS, the Road Traffic Management System, and performance-based standards project have yielded tangible benefits, achieving both safety and productivity gains. In your experience, how can these self-regulatory mechanisms be promoted in the South African context? Thank you for that. So we will pass those questions on to eminent thinkers, and the responses will be included in the blog. So please have a look at that. Now, also note that we've got a third webinar, and that's scheduled for Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, 11th of May, from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock. And this time we'll focus on international transport drivers and trends. Our eminent thinkers will include Ms. Susanna Zamatero, who's the Director General of the International Road Federation and is well known in South Africa, and also Mr. Mike Pittman from the Futures Group of the UK Department for Transport. Once again, the invite you received initially includes the invite to the third webinar, so you won't be receiving the further invitation for Wednesday. So just look at your original invite. That link to the webinar for Wednesday will be on there. And if you don't find it, or if you've misplaced your invitation, you can find the link on SANRAL's website. As I indicated, later on there will also be an online stakeholder workshop. It'll be attended by selected representatives of the various stakeholder organizations, where further inputs will be sought. And the intention is that the workshop will provide inputs into scenario planning and the development of a future desired state that will be used to progress the project. I trust you've enjoyed the webinar and that you have a better understanding of the status of the SANRAL Foresight project, and hope that you will assist the project team by adding further value to the views of the eminent thinkers through points of clarity, asking critical questions, or just giving us further expert input. To those of you who have already posted the questions and comments, thank you. We welcome them. And now in closure, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to meeting most of you again on Wednesday, and have a great day further. Thank you. Goodbye.